I read the text right before Christmas. Stay away from Christmas. Then another one followed. You are dead in our eyes. The words stared back at me in the dim light of my apartment, small black letters carrying more cold than the snow outside my window. My sister replied a minute later with a laughing emoji, a little yellow face that somehow felt sharper than a knife. I stared at the screen until it blurred, then typed the only thing I could manage. Okay, no problem. The phone felt heavy in my hand, as if it already knew this was the moment something ended. I set it down and listened to the radiator ticking in the corner, each sound a heartbeat I did not trust anymore. I had always imagined Christmas as noise and scent and family. When I was little, the air in our house used to smell like cinnamon and pine needles. That was before everything turned into a performance. Now even the memory of it made me tired. I walked to the window and watched the streetlights along North Sheridan Road fade behind the snow. The city moved on, unaware that my world had just split clean down the middle. I whispered the words under my breath, not in anger, but in acceptance. I am done. The apartment was small, but it was mine. A couch I had bought secondhand. A kitchen that held exactly one plate, one fork, one cup. My peace came from how quiet it all was. I sat down at the table and stared at the blinking message icon on my phone. It stayed there for hours, waiting for a reply that would never come. The first Christmas I can remember was when I was 5. Dad had built a sleigh out of plywood and painted it red for the front yard. He used to lift me up and say I was the reason he worked so hard. Years later, at 32, I understood what that meant. It meant I was the reason he could brag about sacrifice while taking credit for my existence. The sleigh had long been thrown away, replaced by new decorations and a stepmother with a perfect smile. Last year's dinner still echoed in my head. The long oak table, the smell of roast beef, the chandelier throwing gold over everything. Dad sat at the head like a judge, carving the meat with slow precision. Madison scrolled on her phone, pretending to listen. Linda. My mom sat quiet, hands folded in her lap, trying to keep the peace that never existed. The moment came after dessert. I had told him I was leaving the family company to work with a nonprofit that supported women leaving abusive homes. His fork clinked against his plate. You don't eat if you don't contribute, he said. No one spoke after that. It was the sound of every wall I had ever tried to climb turning to stone. Tonight I stared at my reflection in the dark window, my face outlined by the glow of streetlights. I was not crying. The tears had stopped years ago. There was only a dull ache and the strange freedom that comes when you have nothing left to prove. My phone buzzed once more, a message from Madison that read simply a laughing emoji again, as if she wanted to make sure I saw it. I turned the phone off and laid it face down. I would not chase ghosts. On the shelf beside the window sat a tin box where I kept old things that once mattered. I opened it and found a photo of me and Mom baking cookies in the old kitchen, flour on our hands. Her handwriting was on the back. Hope you're eating well. I placed the photo back inside and locked the box. I made tea and sat on the couch. The radiator clicked a rhythm I could almost follow. The sound reminded me that time was moving forward whether I wanted it to or not. The air smelled faintly of peppermint from a candle I had burned earlier. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. The silence invited memories I had kept buried. I remembered the way Dad's voice could fill a room until everyone's shoulders tensed. I remembered how Madison learned to laugh at me instead of standing beside me. I remembered Mom's quiet apologies that were never loud enough to stop the damage. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They had not just cut me out tonight. They had been doing it for years, one comment at a time, one withheld word of kindness after another. I picked up a pen and a notepad from the coffee table and wrote 3 lines. Respect is the minimum. I don't negotiate my dignity. I don't reopen old doors. The words looked strange in my handwriting, like they belonged to someone braver. I taped the paper to the refrigerator. Maybe this was how I would start over. Outside, the wind scraped against the window. Somewhere a car alarm echoed, then stopped. I thought about calling Mom, but the phone stayed silent. She had chosen her side years ago, not because she wanted to, but because it was easier. I no longer blamed her. Some people survive by staying quiet. I had decided to survive by speaking less, but living more. The snow thickened. I turned on the small lamp beside the couch, its yellow light warming the edge of the room. I opened my laptop and began searching for community outreach programs. A headline caught my eye. Local initiative seeks volunteers for women's housing project. I clicked and read through the details. The office was only 3 blocks away. The words on the screen pulled something inside me forward, like a door cracking open after a long winter. The next morning, I walked through the snow toward the church community center. The building smelled of coffee and baked bread. A woman named Ruth handed me a clipboard and smiled. She had that look of someone who had seen too much, yet still believed in people. While we sorted donated coats, a man across the room looked up from a stack of boxes. His name tag said Evan Lee. He smiled, a quiet, knowing kind of smile. "You new here?" he asked. "On the first day," I said. He nodded. "Stick around. It gets better once you stop trying to fix everything." That line stayed with me all day. Maybe fixing everything had been my curse. Maybe stepping away was the first real act of love I had ever given myself. When I left the center, the city lights shimmered across the frozen pavement. I could feel something shift inside me, not joy, not sadness, but a calm certainty that I was done bleeding for people who mistook silence for respect. That night I went home, hung my coat, and poured myself another cup of tea. The radiator hummed. I stared again at the 3 lines on my refrigerator and read them aloud until my voice steadied. "Respect is the minimum. I don't negotiate my dignity. I don't reopen old doors." Then I took my phone from the table, blocked both Dad and Madison, and deleted the thread. The screen went blank. So did the part of me that had once begged for their approval. I turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. Somewhere in that quiet, I found the smallest spark of relief. I did not know what would come next, only that this winter would not own me. I whispered into the darkness before sleep found me. You cannot bury someone who has already learned how to bloom. I woke up before sunrise, the city still half asleep under a thin layer of snow, and for the first time in months I did not reach for my phone. The silence felt like a gift. I stood by the window watching the faint glow stretch over Lakeview and realized I had made it through Christmas without a single message, a single apology, a single tear. The old version of me would have filled the space with noise, reaching out to remind people I existed. The woman staring at the morning sky now only wanted peace. I poured a cup of coffee, wrapped myself in a blanket, and told myself that disappearing was not weakness, it was survival. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed quietly, a kind of suspended time where the world seemed to hold its breath. My office was closed, which left me with too many hours to think. I kept busy cleaning, throwing out things that once tied me to the people I was trying to forget. A silver ornament with my initials, a photo frame from a family trip to Wisconsin, a scarf my sister had given me the year she still called me her best friend. I folded them carefully into a box marked Donate. By the 3rd day, the quiet began to settle inside me like a rhythm. I walked through Lincoln Park, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the air crisp enough to sting my cheeks. Children built uneven snowmen near the playground. A woman about my age laughed as her golden retriever leapt through the drifts. I envied that sound light and unburdened. When I reached the frozen pond, I stood for a long moment, breathing the kind of cold that cleared everything out of you. That evening, I went back to the community center. Ruth greeted me with the same warm smile, her red scarf tucked tight around her neck. She handed me a mug of cocoa and pointed toward the stack of donated blankets. That needed sorting. "You came back," she said. "I guess I did," I answered. Evan was there again, organizing boxes near the door. He nodded toward me, his dark hair falling over his forehead, the kind of quiet presence that doesn't demand attention but somehow anchors the room. We worked in silence for a while. Every so often I caught him glancing up, as if reading something in the way I folded each blanket. Finally, he said people who show up after Christmas usually stay. "Why is that?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe they understand that giving doesn't end when the holiday lights come down." There was truth in that. For years, I had measured love by who remembered me during the holidays, who bought gifts or sent cards. I had never thought about love as something you build daily, brick by brick, through presence instead of performance. When we finished, Ruth offered to take us to the small diner across the street. Inside, the air smelled like bacon and maple syrup. I sat in the booth opposite Evan, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that was too hot to drink. He asked what brought me here. I hesitated, then told him the simplest version: family things. He nodded as if he understood the rest. "I used to have those," he said. "Used to." There was a quiet honesty in his tone, no pity, just recognition. The kind that tells you someone else has stood in the same cold. I looked at him, then really looked, and saw a gentleness I had not seen in years. The waitress refilled our cups and asked if we wanted pie. I smiled. "Not tonight, maybe next time." Walking back to my apartment, I realized how much lighter the city felt. The buildings, the streetlights, even the icy wind seemed less sharp. Maybe peace wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you built piece by piece, the same way I had been rebuilding myself since the night I turned off my phone. New Year's Eve approached slowly. Stores filled with gold decorations and noise. I avoided them. Instead, I spent the days volunteering, handing out coats, serving soup, listening to women tell stories that mirrored pieces of my own. One woman named Carla talked about how her dad used to call her ungrateful whenever she asked for kindness. She said it quietly, eyes on her hands as if confessing a crime. I reached across the table and said, "You deserved better." She smiled for the first time that night. Each story I heard made mine feel smaller, not because it mattered less, but because I could finally see it in a larger pattern of survival. It was never just my pain. It was a language shared by too many women taught to keep their heads down at the table. One afternoon, Ruth asked me to help organize a meeting with a few donors who wanted to expand the program. She believed my background in communications would help. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. At the meeting, I listened as people discussed funding outreach and long-term plans. When Ruth introduced me as their new volunteer coordinator, everyone clapped politely. My face warmed, not from embarrassment, but from something that felt like belonging. Afterward, Evan found me near the coat rack. "You were good there," he said. "You spoke like you've been doing this for years." I laughed softly. "I've been doing the opposite for years." He smiled. "Then maybe it's time for a change." That night, I walked home with snow falling in thin spirals under the streetlights. I thought about what he said. Change. The word sounded almost gentle, not like the rupture it had once meant. I stopped by the lake and watched the frozen waves catch the reflection of the city. I realized I was no longer trying to go back to who I was. I was trying to become someone else entirely. I spent New Year's Eve at the center. The volunteers set up candles and paper lanterns, a quiet celebration for those who had nowhere else to be. I poured coffee, handed out blankets, and helped an elderly woman adjust her scarf. The warmth of her gratitude lingered long after she left. Around midnight, the city outside erupted in fireworks, bursts of color lighting up the frost. Inside, we stood together in that soft glow, a small circle of people who had chosen kindness over noise. When I got home after midnight, my apartment felt different. I turned on the lamp, looked around at the empty space, and saw potential where there used to be loneliness. I opened my journal and wrote 2 words under the list on my refrigerator: build forward. I poured a glass of water and sat down on the couch. The phone stayed silent. For once I was glad. Outside, sirens echoed faintly, followed by laughter drifting from the street below. The world was moving on, and so was I. Before I went to bed, I checked the community center's website. They had posted a photo from the evening event. In the background, I saw myself handing a cup of cocoa to a little girl, her smile wide and unguarded. The caption read, "Sometimes the smallest acts rebuild entire lives." I stared at it until my vision blurred not from sadness, but from the quiet weight of gratitude. I turned off the light, let the dark settle around me, and whispered the same words I had written earlier. Build forward. Maybe that was my resolution. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but forward. The snow had already started melting when Ruth called me into her office and said they wanted to make the project official. Her voice carried the kind of warmth that made hard news sound gentle. She handed me a folder with the words Harmony Foundation written in bold across the top. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the texture of the paper like it was something alive. Evan was sitting by the window, his sleeves rolled up, the late afternoon light cutting across his face. Ruth said she believed we could lead it together, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. It wasn't just a volunteer job anymore. It was the beginning. The first few weeks were chaos in the best way. We rented a small office on North Sheridan Road, 3 rooms above a florist shop that smelled like roses and dust. The paint was peeling, the radiator moaned at night, and the front window fogged every morning, but to me it looked like a promise. Evan brought in an old coffee maker. I brought stacks of notepads and a secondhand printer that coughed before it worked. We called it progress. Each morning started with a simple routine. I arrived early, made coffee, turned on the small lamp by the desk, and opened my notebook. I wrote 3 things I was grateful for before checking emails. It helped keep the noise from the past at a distance. By the second week, we had our first few applicants, women who had left toxic families or relationships and needed a place to start over. Their stories were raw, their eyes tired but unbroken. I listened and recognized myself in every pause, every breath they took to keep from falling apart. One of them, a woman named Carla, sat across from me one afternoon, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. She said her husband told her she was worthless and that no one would ever hire her. I told her about the time my dad said something similar, how it had once hollowed me out from the inside. She looked at me and whispered, "How did you survive it?" I said. I stopped believing them. It wasn't the kind of advice found in books, but it was the truth. Evan was good with logistics. He knew how to talk to donors, how to make the numbers sound human. Watching him work reminded me that kindness could be steady and practical, not loud or dramatic. He never asked about my family, and I never offered. We understood that some histories are better left quiet until they're ready to speak. At night, when the office was empty, I stayed behind to clean up. The street outside glowed under streetlights, buses sighing as they stopped at the corner. I kept a small photograph of Mom on the desk, the one from years ago when we baked cookies together. Her smile was soft, the way she looked at me before everything fell apart. I wanted to believe she would have been proud of this. On weekends, I went to the community center to recruit volunteers. Ruth always found a way to make everyone feel useful. She would call across the room, "Emily needs help," and somehow a dozen hands would go up. The sense of community filled a space inside me I didn't know was still empty. We organized our first small event in March, a workshop for women learning job skills. Evan arranged donations of laptops from a tech company, and I prepared a short speech about rebuilding after rejection. The night before the event, I barely slept. I kept pacing my apartment, rewriting my notes until the words started to sound foreign. When the morning came, the sky was the color of pewter and the air smelled like snow again. At the podium, my hands shook for the first few seconds, but then the room quieted and I found my rhythm. I talked about losing everything familiar and finding purpose in the absence. I told them about the night I chose silence instead of begging for love. Their faces turned toward me, a sea of women who had walked through their own storms. When I finished, they clapped, not politely, but with the kind of applause that comes from understanding. I stepped off the stage and saw Ruth's eyes shining. Evan gave me a nod, his version of a standing ovation. After the event, I walked home through falling snow that turned the streets into mirrors. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from social media. I hadn't posted in months, but someone had tagged the foundation in a photo. It was a picture from the workshop, a caption that read, "Harmony starts here." I smiled. For once, my name was attached to something that healed instead of hurt. Later that week, Madison posted a photo of her own. She stood beside Dad at some charity dinner, both of them dressed like perfection. The caption said, "Family means everything." I stared at it for a long moment before closing the app. The old pain flickered sharp but brief, then it passed. I saved the picture into a folder on my laptop labeled Fuel. Every day after that, I poured myself into work. Evan and I started planning a larger fundraiser to keep the program alive. We met with local businesses, small church groups, anyone willing to listen. Some nights we worked past 10, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-written grant proposals. Evan once joked that the radiator's noise had become our background music. In early April, we received our first check from a donor, $10,000. Ruth framed the letter that came with it and hung it on the wall. Seeing that paper made everything real. The foundation wasn't just surviving, it was growing. Sometimes I still thought of Dad not with anger, but with a strange gratitude. His rejection had forced me to build something that didn't rely on his approval. If he could see me now, standing in this small office filled with purpose, I wondered if he would recognize the woman I had become. Maybe not. Maybe that was the point. One evening as I was locking up, Evan handed me a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. He said it was for the new desk I'd been meaning to buy. Inside was a pen engraved with the words, "Keep building." I felt my throat tighten. I thanked him quietly and placed it in my coat pocket, feeling its weight all the way home. When I got back to the apartment, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city was alive below me, lights stretching across the dark like veins of gold. I opened my notebook and wrote down the day's final thoughts. Healing isn't loud. It's steady like snow melting one drop at a time. I looked at the clock. It was past midnight. The radiator hummed in its familiar rhythm, a sound I had come to trust. I closed the notebook and whispered to myself, "Keep building." The words lingered in the quiet, soft and sure, as if they belonged to the life I was finally learning to love. The first time I saw my name on the internet, it was part of a story I hadn't written. Someone on Reddit had posted about a daughter disowned by her family before Christmas, describing how her dad told her she was dead in their eyes. The post ended with a photo of a piece of paper taped to a refrigerator that read, "Respect is the minimum." The words were mine, the picture wasn't. I stared at the screen in the quiet office, the hum of the heater filling the space, and felt something tighten in my chest. Evan looked up from his desk and asked if I was all right. I nodded, but my pulse was pounding. The post had thousands of comments. People were angry. People cared. And somehow the world had turned my private pain into a public story. By that afternoon, the post spread across social media. Some users claimed they knew who the woman was. Others debated whether it was true. I sat there frozen reading strangers argue about my life. One person wrote that forgiveness was overrated. Another said families should stick together no matter what. The comments twisted between compassion and cruelty, and I could not look away. Evan leaned over my shoulder, scanning the thread. "It will die down," he said softly. But I knew better. Stories like that never really die. They just evolve. Ruth came in with coffee and saw the screen. She frowned, recognizing the phrase from my notepad. "Did you post this?" she asked. I shook my head. It must have come from someone who saw the workshop. Maybe Carla or one of the volunteers. She set the cup down and squeezed my shoulder. "Whatever it is, let it stay out there. Maybe it helps someone." For the next few days, the Foundation's inbox filled with messages. Women from all over wrote to say they had been disowned, dismissed, or silenced. They wanted to help, to donate, to share their own stories. It was overwhelming and humbling at the same time. Every letter felt like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Then, Madison's name appeared in my notifications. I hadn't seen it in months. She had posted a long caption on her social media about people playing the victim and seeking attention online. It didn't mention me, but it didn't have to. The timing said everything. The photo attached showed her sitting beside Dad at his company's boardroom, both smiling like the world had never touched them. The caption ended with a single line. "Some people just can't handle being cut off." I closed the app before the old anger could crawl back. I told myself she was still living in a house built on denial. But part of me wondered if she read the post and felt cornered, afraid the truth might expose what our family had hidden behind good manners and Christmas cards. Later that evening, Evan and I met with a journalist from a local paper who wanted to feature the Foundation. She had heard about the viral post and thought it would draw attention to our mission. I hesitated. I didn't want to be a headline about betrayal. I wanted the work to speak for itself. Evan read my silence and told her we preferred to focus on the future, not the past. She agreed, but her eyes lingered on me longer than they should have, as if she already knew the answer to the question she hadn't asked. That night I walked home along Sheridan Road, the lake wind cutting through my coat. The sky was dark and wide, the kind of darkness that makes you question how much of your story belongs to you once you release it into the world. The Reddit post wasn't mine, but the truth inside it was. Maybe that was enough. 2 days later, a new email appeared in the Foundation inbox. The subject line read, "Family Inquiry." I almost deleted it thinking it was spam, but the sender's name made my breath catch. Richard Carter. The message was short, formal, written the way he used to draft company memos. It said he wanted to meet to discuss potential collaboration on community housing projects. Collaboration. I reread the word until it lost meaning. My dad had never used it with me before. Evan noticed my expression and asked what was wrong. I turned the laptop so he could read. He frowned. "Do you think it's real?" I said it was. The tone was unmistakable. He offered to go with me, but I said no. Some doors you have to face alone. We met at a coffee shop downtown, a quiet place near his office. He arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy coat and the same silver cufflinks he had worn at every family dinner. Seeing him again felt like standing at the edge of an old wound. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were the same, sharp and cold. He ordered black coffee and got straight to the point. He said the Foundation had caught attention and that his company might be interested in sponsoring a construction project for shelters. He never said he was proud. He never said he had read the post. I listened quietly, my hands steady around the warm mug. He talked about legacy, reputation, and opportunity. I waited for the apology that never came. When he finished, he leaned back, watching me carefully. He asked if I would consider joining the family company again to manage public relations. I laughed softly, not out of amusement, but disbelief. I told him I already had a family to manage, just not the one he meant. He stiffened his jaw, tightening. "You're making a mistake," he said. I smiled. "Maybe, but it's mine to make." We parted without shaking hands. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering bits of snow along the sidewalk. I watched him walk away until he disappeared into traffic. For a moment, I felt a wave of something close to grief. Then it passed. When I returned to the office, Evan was waiting. He didn't ask for details, just handed me a cup of tea and said, "You did what you needed to." The warmth of that small gesture spread through me. I told him about Dad's offer, about the way he used words like opportunity to disguise control. Evan nodded. "Some people only understand relationships as transactions," he said. That night, the Foundation's website crashed from too much traffic. Donations poured in small amounts from hundreds of people. The Reddit story had found a home in what we were building. The irony wasn't lost on me. My dad had spent his life constructing buildings. I was building something he could never own. A week later, the journalist published her article. The headline read, "From rejection to renewal, a woman turns pain into purpose." She didn't use my family's names, but the parallels were clear. The photo showed me and Evan in the small office, surrounded by stacks of donated clothes and a banner that read Harmony Foundation. The comments online were full of encouragement. A few cruel ones surfaced, as they always do, but they didn't touch me. I had learned that not every voice deserves an answer. By spring, the city began to thaw. The streets glistened with melted snow, and the trees outside our office showed the first signs of green. Life was moving forward quietly, persistently. I stood by the window watching the light shift across the street and realized how far I had come from the woman who once sat alone on Christmas night. Evan walked in holding a folder of new grant proposals. He smiled and said, "The city council wants to meet next week. Maybe it's time to grow again." I looked at him and thought of all the versions of me that had led to this moment. The daughter who was disowned, the woman who learned to disappear, the builder who found her own foundation. I turned back to the window, watching the reflection of my own face fade into the afternoon light. The past was still there, but it no longer held me. Somewhere in that mix of shadow and sunlight, I found what I had been searching for: peace that did not depend on forgiveness. The morning of the interview, I woke up before dawn with a tightness in my chest that felt like both fear and anticipation. The city outside was still dark, the kind of gray that hides everything before light decides what to reveal. I made coffee and sat by the window, the steam rising in thin curls, the cup warm in my hands. I had been invited to speak on a local talk show about the foundation and the stories that had inspired it. They wanted a personal angle, something real. I knew what they were really asking for. They wanted the story behind the story, the one I had spent years trying to bury. By 7, I was sitting in the small green room at the WCHI studio, surrounded by people checking their notes, fixing their hair, rehearsing polite laughter. A woman from makeup dabbed powder on my face and asked what my foundation was. "Called Harmony," I said. She smiled at the coincidence. A producer handed me a microphone pack and told me to relax, that it was just a conversation. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure conversations on camera ever felt that way. When they called my name, the lights hit first. Bright, hot, blinding. The host greeted me with the practiced warmth of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She asked about the mission, about rebuilding lives after loss, and I spoke easily about the work, about the women who had walked through our doors and found strength where shame used to live. But then she leaned forward, voice softening, and asked where the idea had come from. I hesitated. The camera's red light blinked. Somewhere in the silence, I heard my dad's voice telling me that our family's business was built on privacy and reputation. I took a breath and said that sometimes purpose is born from rejection. I told them I had once been told I was dead in the eyes of people who should have loved me. The audience went quiet. The host asked what I did when I heard those words. I said I chose to live anyway. It was not rehearsed. It was not planned. But when the interview ended, I felt lighter than I had in years. I left the studio, the winter sun breaking through clouds like a quiet applause. Evan met me outside with 2 coffees. He had watched from the waiting room. "You did good," he said. I smiled. I think I finally said it out loud. By afternoon, clips from the interview were online. The foundation's social pages flooded with messages. Strangers wrote that they saw themselves in my words. One comment read, "You can't bury someone who has learned to bloom." Seeing my own sentence echoed back to me from people I had never met brought an ache I couldn't name. Maybe healing wasn't private after all. Maybe it needed witnesses. That night, I sat in the office with Evan and Ruth as we went through emails. One caught my eye. The sender's name made my stomach drop. It was Madison. The subject line read, "Congratulations on your performance." The body was short. "Dad says you've always been good at playing the victim. Enjoy your fame." I stared at it until the words blurred, then closed the laptop without replying. Ruth noticed something shift in my face but didn't ask. Later, while we cleaned up, Evan asked if I was all right. I told him about the email. He poured more coffee, sat beside me, and said people who are still asleep will always resent those who wake up first. His calm was grounding like steady hands holding glass. The next morning, the story had made national news. A few larger outlets picked it up, calling it "The Daughter Who Chose Boundaries." They ran photos from the interview, my words in bold across headlines. Donations tripled overnight. The foundation's voicemail filled with reporters asking for comment. I felt dizzy from the attention, but proud too. We were helping more people than ever. That weekend, while sorting through mail, Ruth handed me a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. The letters were sharp and deliberate, like someone trying too hard to stay composed. It read, "You should be ashamed of dragging family into your act. Stop before you regret it." No signature. I knew the handwriting anyway. I put the letter in a drawer and locked it. There was a time it would have broken me. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. The more I grew, the smaller they became. We decided to host a public fundraiser to turn the momentum into something lasting. The venue would be the Lakeshore Civic Center, a modest hall overlooking the lake with high windows and soft amber lighting. Evan said it should be a celebration, not a statement. I agreed. We called it the Night of Renewal. In the weeks leading up to it, every spare moment went into planning. Volunteers arranged tables local musicians offered to play, and small businesses donated food and decorations. I watched the pieces come together like a mosaic built from kindness. There was something almost sacred about seeing strangers believe in an idea that had once been just a whisper between two people in a drafty office. The night of the event arrived with clear skies and a sharp wind off the lake. I wore a simple black dress and a silver bracelet Mom had given me years ago. The hall filled quickly, voices blending into a warm hum. When it was time to speak, I stepped onto the small stage, my heart steady. I looked at the crowd and thought about the girl I used to be, sitting at her dad's table, counting the seconds until it was polite to leave. I thought about the words that had once defined me. "You are dead in our eyes." I let the silence hold for a moment, then said that sometimes what dies inside you is not love but illusion. I told them we can turn betrayal into foundation, that we can rebuild even from ashes. The applause rose like a wave, soft but sure, and for a heartbeat I let it wash over me. After the speech, Evan found me near the refreshment table. He handed me a glass of water and said quietly, "You were radiant up there." I told him I wasn't sure if radiant was the right word. He smiled. "Maybe it's the only one." When the event ended, we stood by the tall windows watching the city lights shimmer over the lake. My phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. I read the interview. "We need to talk." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. I locked the screen, slipped the phone into my bag, and kept my eyes on the horizon. The lake was still the night clear, and I could see my reflection faintly in the glass. Behind me, laughter drifted from the last few guests, the sound mingling with the low music playing near the door. For the first time in a long time, I felt both strong and fragile, like glass under steady hands. I took one last look at the lake before turning back toward the hall, the weight of that unseen message pressing somewhere deep but not enough to break me. Whatever was waiting, I knew I could face it now. The text came late at night, just as I was turning off the lights. It was from Madison. 3 short words that made my pulse slow and quicken at the same time. "Mom is sick." I stared at the screen until the glow faded, then sat down on the edge of the bed. I hadn't heard from my sister in months, not since her last message filled with accusation. Now, out of all people, she was the one reaching out. I read it again, trying to hear the tone behind the words. There was no apology, no warmth, only urgency. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I called the hospital number she sent in the next message. A nurse answered, her voice soft, tired. "Linda Carter was stable," she said, "but I should come if I could." By morning, I was on the road. The highway stretched empty, the winter sun cutting through pale clouds. Chicago shrank behind me as I drove north toward the small town where my mom had been living quietly since the divorce. I remembered the last time I saw her sitting in her kitchen, stirring sugar into tea as if sweetness could solve everything. She had said she was fine, that she liked the quiet. I had wanted to believe her. When I walked into the hospital room, the air smelled of antiseptic and fading flowers. Mom was asleep, her hair silver now, her hands folded over a thin blanket. Madison stood by the window, phone in hand, her posture too straight. She looked up when she heard me and froze as if seeing a ghost. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us was its own language, built from years of unspoken things. "You came," she said finally, her tone uncertain. I nodded. "How bad is it?" She shrugged, glancing at the machines beside the bed. "They say it's pneumonia." It scared her this time. I walked closer, taking in every line on Mom's face, every soft breath. Time had etched her gently. I felt something twist inside me, that familiar mix of love and resentment and guilt. Madison sat down, crossing her arms. She looked thinner, paler, the shine from her perfect life dimmed. "Dad didn't come," she said quietly. "He said hospitals make him uncomfortable." I almost laughed. "He built them," I said. She looked at me, eyes sharp for a second, then softened. "You always make it sound like everything he does is wrong." "Maybe some of it is." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to argue about. Mom stirred, then her eyes fluttering open. When she saw me, she smiled weakly. "Emily," she whispered. Her voice was so small it broke me. I took her hand, cold and fragile, and she squeezed it with surprising strength. "You look well," she said. I wanted to tell her that I had built something beautiful out of the wreckage she once tried to protect me from, but instead I said I missed you. She nodded, eyes glistening. The doctor came in a few minutes later, explaining her condition in the calm rhythm of someone who delivers both hope and warning every day. She would recover with rest, he said, but she needed support. Madison promised she would stay a few days. I said I could help with the bills. The doctor thanked us both and left. After he was gone, Madison leaned back in the chair, arms folded again. "I saw you on television," she said. "Dad did too. He wasn't happy." I smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for him." She looked away. "He said you embarrassed the family." Then she paused. "But I thought you looked strong." I wasn't expecting that from her. The words landed awkwardly but honest. Maybe it was the first time she had ever admitted respect without realizing it. Later, when Mom drifted back to sleep, Madison and I went to the hospital cafeteria. The coffee was terrible, the kind that tasted of burnt metal, but we drank it anyway. She told me Dad's company was struggling. The construction contracts had slowed, investors were pulling back. He was trying to save face, she said, but people were talking. I listened quietly, the same way I used to when she bragged about her perfect life. Only now her voice had a tremor. At one point, she said, "Maybe you were right to leave." I looked at her, unsure what to do with the sentence. The girl who once laughed at my pain was now sitting across from me. Her mascara smudged her voice, barely holding. I realized then that she was not my enemy. She was just another casualty of the same man who raised us to believe silence was loyalty. When I left the hospital that evening, the air outside was cold enough to bite. I stood in the parking lot, watching the sky turn from gray to deep blue. The streetlights blinked on one by one. I thought about the first Christmas after the divorce, when Mom had bought us matching scarves. Dad hadn't shown up that year either. She had smiled anyway, pretending it didn't hurt. I had inherited that same habit until the night I stopped pretending. Over the next few days, I visited every morning. Mom grew stronger, her color returning. She would talk in soft fragments about the past, about recipes, about neighbors from years ago. One afternoon, she said, I saw the interview. I didn't know whether to be proud or sad. I told her she didn't need to choose. Pride and sadness could live together. She smiled. "You got that from me." When she was discharged, I helped her settle back into her small apartment. It was neat and quiet, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. On her kitchen wall hung a photo I hadn't seen in years. The three of us in front of the Christmas tree before everything cracked. I touched the frame lightly. She noticed and said, "You were so full of light that day." "You still are, Emily." I stayed the night on her couch. The ticking of the old clock reminded me of the radiator back home. It was the same steady rhythm that had carried me through winters of silence. As I drifted towards sleep, I heard Mom whisper from her room, almost like a prayer. "I'm sorry for what I didn't stop." The words slid through the dark, quiet but sharp. I closed my eyes and let them settle without answering. Some apologies are not meant to be accepted. They are simply meant to exist. The next morning, I made breakfast before leaving. Madison showed up just as I was packing. She looked tired but softer. "Mom says you're coming back for her birthday," she said. I nodded. "If I can." She smiled faintly. "I hope you do." Then she added, "I think she still believes one day we'll all sit together again." I told her some people never stop believing. She sighed. Maybe that's her gift. Or her curse. On the drive back to Chicago, the radio played an old song Mom used to hum while cooking. The melody filled the car light and slow, wrapping around the spaces I didn't know were still tender. I didn't cry. I just drove the skyline, rising ahead like a promise I had built myself. When I reached the foundation office, the mailbox was overflowing. Evan greeted me with his usual calm. "Everything all right?" he asked. I nodded. "My mom's home." He smiled. "Good, that's something." I told him about Madison, about how strange it felt to see her cracks. He listened quietly, then said families don't always heal together. Sometimes they heal in pieces. That night I sat in my office after everyone left. The city lights blinked against the window, soft and distant. I thought about Mom's whispered apology, about Madison's tired eyes, about the man who had built walls instead of homes. For the first time I didn't feel anger, only release. I opened my notebook and wrote one line beneath the old list. Some things break so something better can be built. Then I closed it and turned off the lamp. The room went dark except for the faint reflection of my face in the window. I didn't look away. The night of the gala arrived colder than expected, the kind of cold that bites through silk and confidence alike. I stood backstage at the Lakeshore Civic Center, my heart steady but loud enough to feel. Through the curtain, I could see the crowd gathering, faces bright under the soft amber lights, the hum of conversation filling the air. The banner above the stage read Harmony Foundation Annual Gala, though it felt less like an event and more like the closing of a long and bruised chapter. Evan adjusted the microphone on my jacket and gave me a small nod. His calm was contagious. He whispered that the mayor was in the audience and a few journalists, too. I smiled faintly. I wasn't there for them. Tonight was for every version of myself that had survived being told she was nothing. When they called my name, I walked onto the stage. The applause felt distant like waves against glass. I took a breath and looked out at the rows of people who had come to support us. Behind them, the lake shimmered through the tall windows, dark and endless. The spotlight was warm on my face, but I could still feel the cold crawling up my spine. I began to speak. I talked about the women who had found their footing through the foundation, about the small victories that grew into second chances. And then, without meaning to, I said the words that had once defined me. I was told once that I was dead in their eyes. Maybe that was true. But the thing about death is that it frees you. You stop waiting to be seen. You start building your own light. For a second, the room was silent. Then applause rose again, louder, heavier, filled with something that felt like understanding. Cameras flashed. Someone in the front row wiped away tears. I stepped back from the podium and let the sound carry me. It wasn't pride that filled me. It was peaceful, sharp, and clear as glass. After the ceremony, people gathered around, offering handshakes and congratulations. I smiled and thanked them, my mind already drifting toward the quiet I craved after nights like this. Ruth hugged me tightly, saying she had never been prouder. Evan stood a few steps away, talking with a group of donors. When our eyes met, he lifted his glass slightly, a silent toast. I nodded back. Later, when most of the crowd had left, I slipped outside for air. The wind coming off the lake was bitter, the city skyline glimmering across the water. I pulled my coat tighter and let the cold remind me that I was still alive, still choosing this version of myself. My phone buzzed in my bag. Another unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. The message was short. "We saw your little speech. You think this makes you better than us." It was unsigned, but I didn't need a name. I locked the phone and placed it back in my pocket. The chills settled deeper into my bones, but I refused to let it reach my heart. Somewhere behind me, the doors opened and closed. Evan's voice broke the silence. "You okay?" he asked. I turned to see him holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the night. I took one and nodded. "Just ghosts trying to keep warm." He smiled. "Let them freeze." We walked along the pier, the city lights reflecting off the water like 1,000 quiet witnesses. He asked about my mom, about Madison. I told him Mom was healing and Madison was learning. He said that sounded like progress. I laughed softly. Progress always looks quieter than people expect. When we went back inside, Ruth was collecting leftover decorations, humming to herself. The hall felt larger, now emptier, the echo of music still clinging to the air. She handed me a small box. "A reporter dropped this off for you," she said. Inside was a plaque engraved with the words "Woman of the Year." I traced the letters, slowly feeling their weight. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like closure. The next morning, the papers carried photos from the event. One headline read, "From Rejection to Renewal." Another called me the Silent Revenger. The phrase made me laugh. Revenge wasn't what this was, it was a reclamation. Still, I understood why it resonated. People wanted to believe in justice that didn't need to scream. At the foundation, the phones rang all day. Donations poured in, new volunteers signed up. Women stopped by with thank you notes. I worked until my voice went hoarse. At one point, Evan leaned against my office door and said we should celebrate. I told him we just had. He shook his head. "No, I mean really celebrate. Dinner, no cameras, no speeches." I thought about it for a moment, then said yes. That evening, we went to a quiet restaurant near the lake, one of those hidden places with low lights and soft music. We talked about everything except the foundation. He told me about his childhood in Ohio, how he used to build forts in the woods and dream about leaving small towns behind. I told him about the house I grew up in, how the walls always felt too polite to hold real love. When the meal ended, he asked what I wanted next. I didn't have an answer. Maybe that was the beauty of it. For the first time, I wasn't living as a reaction to pain. I was simply living. When I got home that night, the apartment felt unfamiliar, almost too quiet. I walked to the refrigerator and looked at the papers still taped there. Respect is the minimum. I don't negotiate my dignity. I don't reopen old doors. The edges were curling now, yellowed with time. I smiled. The rules are still held. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Madison. She had sent a photo of Mom sitting at her kitchen table, holding a bouquet of flowers. The message said, "She's proud of you." That was all. I felt something tighten in my throat, a small knot of emotion I hadn't expected. I typed back thank you and left it at that. The next week was a blur of follow-up meetings, press calls, and planning sessions. We were no longer a small project above a florist shop. The city council had approved a grant to expand our facilities. Evan said we'd need a new building, bigger staff, stronger systems. I listened half in awe, half in disbelief. The dream had outgrown the pain that birthed it. One afternoon, while packing up for the day, Ruth handed me an envelope that had been delivered by courier. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard Carter. My pulse skipped. I waited until everyone left before opening it. Inside was a short note written in his familiar neat script. It said only 3 words, "You made noise." I stared at it for a long time, then folded it back into the envelope. He still didn't understand. What I had made wasn't noise. It was music that finally belonged to me. That night I walked along the lake again, the wind calmer now, the water black and still. The city lights shimmered across the surface like a path leading somewhere new. I thought about Mom's voice, soft and forgiving, about Madison's hesitant smile, about Evan's quiet faith. The world that had once rejected me was now opening, not because I forced it, but because I had stopped asking permission. I stood there until my hands grew numb, then whispered into the cold air, "I'm still here." The sound disappeared into the night, carried somewhere beyond the lake. When I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in a window, a faint image framed by light. For the first time, I didn't see a woman who was cut off or disowned. I saw someone whole, someone who had turned silence into strength. And that, I thought, was the only revenge that ever mattered. The night before New Year's Eve, the city felt like it was holding its breath. I stood by the tall windows of my office, the glow from the streetlights spilling across the floor, and listened to the quiet hum of Chicago settling into winter. Outside, snow drifted slowly down, soft enough to hide the noise of everything that had ever hurt me. The Harmony Foundation had closed early, and the staff had gone home to their families. I stayed behind, sorting through the last-minute details for our year-end celebration. We had raised enough to expand 2 shelters, fund a new outreach program, and give dozens of women their first real home in years. It should have felt like victory, but all I could feel was the stillness before something inevitable. The building was empty except for the faint sound of the radiator clicking and the low rhythm of my own heartbeat. I was thinking about Mom's recovery, about Madison's cautious text on Christmas Day that said simply, "Hope you're doing well." It was progress, small but honest. I wanted to believe the year was ending cleanly, that I could finally step into the next without ghosts. I was wrong. It started with the first ring. The office phone on my desk lit up, the number blocked. I let it ring until it stopped. Then came another, this time my cell phone. Then another. The vibration echoed against the wooden desk, insistent, like knocking. I ignored it, but the ringing started again. I answered without thinking. There was silence then, breathing then, my dad's voice low and cold. "You think this changes anything?" My throat tightened. I hadn't heard his voice since that meeting at the coffee shop. I said his name quietly, not as a greeting, but as a question. He kept talking, his tone flat. "You can play saint for strangers all you want. You'll always be a disappointment." I should have hung up, but the years of conditioning made my hand freeze. His words rolled through me like smoke. I could almost see him standing in his office, cufflinks shining, face tight with resentment. I took a slow breath. Then I said, "You called me. That means something still matters." He didn't reply, only the sound of his exhale. Then the line went dead. For a long time I sat there staring at the phone, the reflection of the city lights trembling on the glass. The ringing didn't return, but the echo stayed. It followed me as I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped out into the cold. By the time I reached my apartment, the streets were almost empty. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks tested the sky early, small bursts of light against the dark. I made tea, tried to quiet my thoughts, and told myself it was over. But the knocking started again, not from a phone this time, from my front door. It was soft at first, then louder, then constant. I looked through the peephole. Nothing but darkness and the faint shimmer of snow. I opened the door slowly, half expecting the night to swallow me. No one was there, only a box sitting on the welcome mat tied with plain twine. I bent down and picked it up. Inside was a stack of old photographs. Family pictures, Christmas mornings, birthdays, graduations. Every image where I was smiling had been cut in half. My face is missing. I stood there in the doorway, the cold air brushing my skin, the city silent behind me. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. The last picture in the pile was from Christmas before the divorce. My dad standing tall, Mom beside him, Madison in front, and the empty space where I should have been. On the back, written in his sharp handwriting, were 5 words. "Stay away from Christmas, Emily." I closed the box, placed it on the table, and locked the door. My hands trembled not from fear, but from clarity. He wasn't trying to reach me. He was trying to remind me that even in his silence, he believed he still owned the narrative. But this time I had something he never would. An audience that believed in my story, not his. The next morning was New Year's Eve. I arrived at the Civic Center early hours before anyone else to oversee the final setup. The hall glowed with strings of golden lights, the scent of pine and vanilla filling the air. It was beautiful, warm, and alive. Evan joined me, his scarf pulled high against the cold. He asked if I was ready. I told him I had never been more ready for anything in my life. When the guests arrived, the air turned electric. Music played softly, glasses clinked, laughter filled the corners. Cameras flashed, reporters hovered near the back, and I moved through it all like someone floating. When the clock struck 8, Evan stepped onto the stage to introduce me. I took the microphone, the same one I had held at the first workshop months ago, and looked out at the faces before me. I spoke about the year behind us, about rebuilding lives from broken pieces, about the women who had turned fear into foundation. Then I paused the room, waiting. I said that I used to think family was something you were born into, but I had learned that sometimes family is what you build after you survive. Them. A murmur moved through the crowd. I continued. Tonight I stand here because of every woman who refused to disappear, who chose light over silence. Applause rose again, stronger, rolling like thunder through the hall. As it faded, I noticed movement near the entrance. 2 figures stood by the doors. My breath caught. My dad and Madison. He was in a dark coat, his posture rigid. She looked uncertain, clutching her phone like a shield. For a moment, the world tilted, sound falling away. I left the stage, slowly walked through the crowd, and met them halfway. People turned to watch. My dad's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold but searching. He started to speak, but I lifted my hand. My voice came out quiet, steady. "The dead don't come back." The words hung in the air, final and clean. He flinched just barely, and Madison's eyes filled with tears. I turned, walked back toward the stage, and never looked back. The applause began again, but this time I couldn't tell if it was for the speech or the boundary. Maybe it didn't matter. When the night ended, I stayed behind as the hall emptied. The volunteers cleaned, the music faded, and I stood alone by the tall windows, watching snow fall across the lake. My reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. For the first time, I didn't see the woman who needed to be accepted. I saw the woman who had learned how to close the door. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks bloomed above the skyline, bursts of red and gold reflected in the water. Behind me, the doorbell to the hall rang sharp and insistent. I turned, but didn't move to answer. "Let it ring," I whispered. "The dead don't come back." The morning after the gala, Chicago looked washed clean, the streets glistening from melted snow and the light soft as milk. I woke late, the kind of sleep that feels heavy but earned. My phone was already buzzing on the nightstand, messages stacking faster than I could read. News alerts, articles, emails from people I didn't know. My speech had gone viral overnight. Clips of me saying "the dead don't come back" were everywhere. Some called it powerful, others called it cruel. I scrolled through the headlines until the words started to blur. Woman of the Year confronts family on stage. Daughter turns rejection into redemption. Everyone had a version of my story. For once, I didn't feel the need to correct it. I made coffee, turned on the radio, and listened to a morning show host mention my name as part of a segment about forgiveness and boundaries. They debated whether my response to my dad had been too harsh. A woman called in to say that sometimes walking away is the kindest thing you can do for yourself. I smiled, stirring my coffee slowly, grateful for strangers who understood without needing to know every detail. At the foundation, the phones were already ringing when I arrived. Ruth waved me in from behind the front desk, her eyes bright. "You broke the internet," she said. Evan stood near the window, phone in hand, grinning. He told me we had received over 300 new donations in 12 hours. I laughed, the sound bubbling up before I could stop it. It felt good. A release of everything that had been wound tight inside me for years. By noon, reporters started showing up at the office. Most of them wanted to talk about the speech, about that one sentence. I told Ruth to decline politely. The work mattered more than the headlines. Still, I could feel the ripple of it everywhere. People walking by the office window slowed down to look inside, curious. One woman came in quietly, leaving an envelope with a handwritten note. It said, "You gave me courage to walk away too. Thank you." Inside was a small check for $50. I held it for a moment, letting the inked words soak into me before placing it gently on Ruth's desk. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for air. Across the street, a vendor sold roasted chestnuts, the smell rich and comforting. I bought a small paper bag and ate them one by one as I walked along the frozen edge of the lake. The city hummed behind me, alive and loud. My thoughts drifted to Dad and Madison. I hadn't heard from either of them since the night before. I wondered if he had expected me to flinch on that stage to shrink. Instead, I had stood taller than I ever thought possible. When I returned to the office, Evan was waiting with his laptop open. He said a national publication wanted to do a feature on the foundation. They wanted to focus on the work, not the drama. I agreed on one condition, that they keep the story about the women we helped, not the one I was born into. He promised they would. The following week blurred into interviews, meetings, and quiet nights spent answering emails from women across the country. They wrote about dads who never said sorry, about sisters who betrayed them, about learning to live without permission. Their stories were mirrors of my own, some more painful, some braver. I read every one. Each message reminded me why I had built this, why I had chosen peace over revenge. One evening while reviewing reports, Ruth handed me a letter that had been mailed directly to me. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. I opened it carefully. It was from one of Dad's former employees, a man who had worked at his company for over 20 years. He wrote that after the gala, several investors had pulled out, citing concerns about his behavior and ethics. The company's reputation was unraveling. He said he thought I should know. I sat back in my chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. It wasn't a triumph I felt. It was something quieter, more complex. A strange mix of relief and sorrow. Justice, even when it arrives, doesn't erase history. It just rearranges it. Evan found me staring out the window and asked if I was all right. I told him yes. I just needed a moment to understand what it meant to finally be free. That weekend, I drove north to visit Mom. She was stronger now, moving slower but smiling more. Her apartment smelled like cinnamon and tea. When she opened the door, she hugged me longer than usual. She said she saw the speech online and that it had made her cry. I told her I hadn't meant to make anyone cry, only to tell the truth. She said sometimes truth and tears walk hand in hand. We spent the afternoon talking about small things. The weather, her new neighbor, the book she was reading. Then she grew quiet, tracing the rim of her teacup with her finger. "He called me," she said softly. "Your dad. He said he doesn't recognize the woman you've become." I smiled, not bitterly, but with calm. "That's fine," I said. She nodded. I think it scared him to see what happens when his control doesn't reach someone. Before I left, she handed me an old photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was from a school recital. I was holding a violin, grinning at the camera, Mom kneeling beside me. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "You always had your own song." I slipped it into my coat pocket. The words followed me all the way back to the city. The next day, Evan and I met with the city council to finalize the grant for the new shelter. The vote passed unanimously. Afterward, we walked out into the sunlight, both of us laughing, the air crisp and full of promise. He said he was proud of me, proud of what we had built. I told him I was proud of us. For a long time, we stood there, watching the flags outside City Hall sway in the wind, both of us knowing the foundation had grown far beyond what either of us had imagined. That night, I returned home and opened my journal. The paper still smelled faintly of coffee and ink. I wrote down the day's events, then paused. The city outside my window was alive with movement, headlights threading through snow-lined streets. I thought about how far I had come since that first message. Stay away from Christmas. I no longer needed to erase it. It was part of the map that led me here. Before bed, I scrolled through the Foundation's social page one last time. Among the thousands of comments, one stood out. It was from a woman who simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that peace can be loud too." I read it twice, smiled, and closed the laptop. As I turned off the lights, the room filled with the soft glow of the city beyond my window. Somewhere out there, people were still watching my story unfold. But for me, the noise had quieted. The war inside had ended. What remained was steady and still like water after a storm. The year turned quietly without fireworks or noise. I woke before dawn, the sky still bruised with winter light, and watched the first pale sun rise over Lake Michigan. The world outside my window looked calm, the streets covered in thin snow that glittered like scattered salt. Inside, everything smelled of coffee and paper. My desk was covered with files for the new shelter project, plans and letters and thank you notes from women whose lives had begun again. It felt strange, sitting there in the same apartment where the silence used to hurt, and realizing it no longer did. The quiet now felt like proof that I had survived. At the foundation, the morning buzzed with movement. Volunteers packed supplies, phones rang, laughter drifted through the hallway. We were preparing to open our newest center on the west side, a space for women and children escaping toxic homes. Evan was everywhere at once, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up. When he saw me, he smiled. "You made this happen," he said. I told him we all did. He shook his head. "No, Emily, you built this from ashes." The ribbon cutting was set for the afternoon. By noon, the place was alive with color. Balloons lined the entrance, a small crowd gathered, cameras flashed. Ruth adjusted her scarf, whispering that she'd never seen anything so beautiful. I stood near the door watching women carry boxes inside, their faces lit with something that looked like hope. When the mayor arrived, reporters followed. Someone handed me scissors wrapped in a red ribbon. I stepped forward, took a breath, and cut through the line. Applause filled the air. Cameras clicked. For a moment, everything went still. I could feel the cold wind brush against my face, the sound of laughter spilling from the children playing nearby. I thought of that first night alone, reading the text that had cut me out of my own family. "Stay away from Christmas. You're dead in our eyes." Now standing here, I understood something. They had buried the wrong person. After the ceremony, I found a quiet corner behind the building. Evan joined me, handing over a cup of tea. The air was sharp, but the sunlight was bright enough to make it feel like spring was somewhere near. He asked what I would do next. I told him I hadn't decided. Maybe write about it, maybe travel, maybe just rest. He said resting sounded radical for someone like me. I laughed. Maybe revolution starts with rest. Later that evening, I drove to my mom's apartment. She greeted me at the door with her warm, familiar smile. Madison was there too, sitting on the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of cocoa. The tension that once filled every room we shared had softened. Mom had cooked dinner, the table small but full, just enough for the three of us. We ate quietly, the clink of silverware against plates marking a rhythm that felt almost new. After dinner, Madison pulled out her phone and showed me a photo from the gala. It was the moment I had stood on stage, saying those words that would not stop echoing. She said she had watched it a dozen times, and that she didn't know how to feel at first. Then she looked at me and said, "I think you were right." I didn't expect to cry, but I did. It wasn't the words that moved me, but the way she said them soft, without defense. I told her it wasn't about being right. It was about being free. She nodded, her eyes wet. Mom reached across the table, her hand resting over mine. The warmth of her skin felt like forgiveness, not for them, but for myself. Before I left, Mom hugged me tightly. "You did something I couldn't," she whispered. "You turned pain into something useful." I told her I learned it from watching her survive. She smiled. "That's all I ever wanted for you." On the drive home, the city glowed against the night sky, each light a quiet pulse of life. I rolled down the window just enough to feel the cold air sharp and clean. Somewhere between traffic lights, I realized I was no longer waiting for closure. The story had already closed itself. Back at my apartment, I poured wine into a glass, turned off the overhead light, and let the glow from the street fill the room. My notebook was still on the desk. I opened it to the last page and wrote one line. "Peace is not forgiveness. It is the decision to stop bleeding for people who never learned to love gently." I closed the book and smiled. The next morning, the city woke to snow again. I walked to the lakefront, my breath fogging in the air. The horizon, a thin line of silver and blue. The world looked endless open. I sat on a bench and watched the water move beneath a thin crust of ice. For the first time, I thought about my dad without anger, just distance. Maybe that was what healing really meant. Not forgetting, but no longer needing to remember. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed. A message from Ruth. The shelter was full already, every bed taken, every woman safe. I stared at the words, then looked out at the lake again. The wind was cold against my cheeks, but my chest felt warm. I whispered a small thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the quiet itself. When I got home, I placed the old family box on the kitchen table. I opened it one last time. Inside were the cut photographs my dad had sent. I gathered them piece by piece and placed them into a new envelope. Then I walked down to the lake, stood at the edge, and let the wind carry them from my hands. The paper scattered, drifting like snow over the water. As I watched them fade, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The hurt, the silence, the rebuilding. Every step had led me to this exact place, this quiet, this peace. I turned back toward the city, the skyline bright and alive, and walked home without looking back. At night before I slept, I sat at my desk again and looked into the camera on my laptop. I recorded one final message for the Foundation's supporters. I spoke about what it meant to choose boundaries, to turn pain into purpose, to create a life that belongs entirely to yourself. Then I ended with a smile and said, "If my story has touched you, share yours. Tell me what strength looks like for you." Subscribe, comment, send it into the world. We build forward together. When I turned off the camera, the room went quiet. The snow outside glowed under the streetlights. I whispered the words that had carried me through everything. The dead don't come back, but the living, they rise.